What famous person didn't deserve all the hate that they got? Rebecca Black got roasted hard at 14 years old for the song Friday. Patrice Wilson was the producer and got paid by both Black's mom and a good chunk of the proceeds, but he flew under the radar from the abuse. Granted, it's a dumb song, but the hatred was immense for a 14-year-old kid. Lincoln Park, but more specifically, Chester Bennington. He was bullied severely in high school for being skinny. He was also sexually abused as a child, so he wrote about his feelings. He was addicted to several drugs before he even turned 17. He did so much for his fans, like even with a broken hand he continued to perform, but then the band changed genres, went a little less heavy, more softer instruments, but the lyrics were just as deep. The loudest fans didn't care, they hated it. They bullied the band intensely. In 2006, Chester had a cyberstalker who wouldn't leave him or his family alone. The reasoning she gave when she got caught: "I was bored." She tortured Chester, put him on edge even after she was caught. The hot coffee McDonald's lady. The story that I had heard and believed for years was that some woman burned her tongue a little and sued McDonald's for not marking clearly that their coffee was hot, when the reality was that McDonald's raised the temperature of their coffee way higher than normal. It spilled on her when getting it in the drive-thru, and her burns were horrifically severe and she needed skin grafts. She was suing for so much because it literally how much her medical bills cost. But so many people ridiculed her and the case for years. Edit: people calling me out for saying higher than boiling point. I just meant that it was really really hot. She didn't sue for that much is the thing. She initially just asked for $20,000 in a settlement to pay for her medical bills. She had to undergo medical treatment for 2 years. McDonald's basically told her to go pound sand and told her they'd give her $800. She lawyered up and they tried to resettle after proceedings began for $90,000 and were again refused. She was only awarded that much money after it came out in court that McDonald's knew their coffee was a burn hazard and that they had had multiple other settlements for coffee burns. The woman was awarded with $200,000 and $2.7 million in punitive damages for McDonald's, but actually only received $640,000 of the total amount since a judge later reduced that amount. As a side note, McDonald's still serves their coffee at the same temperature today, they just have a bigger warning on the cup so that it's harder to win if you end up needing skin grafts after a spill nowadays. I remember we covered that in literacy in like year 9/10, UK, would have been like 13 to 15, and our teacher gave us the basic rundown. Essentially was just this woman bought a McDonald's coffee, she wasn't paying attention, and she spilled it on herself. Is McDonald's in the wrong? And we were all like, no, of course not. Whereupon she told us the whole story and my God, you could hear a pin drop afterwards. What happened to her was horrific and easily preventable if they had just clearly marked that the coffee was incredibly hot, and she only wanted them to cover the medical expenses. She was suing for medical bills, which was like $150K, but the judge presiding over the case gave her more because it wasn't the first time it happened, and she thought it would teach MCD a lesson about raising temps to dangerous levels. That's how bad it was, but no blame the victim. Sorry you picked the one that always makes me angry. Edit: I don't proofread. I believe she sued for medical costs which were some thousands, and got awarded a slice of profit from the coffee which then turned out to be millions. They already had been fined prior serving coffee too hot. But most idiotic thing McDonald's did is they spent most likely millions in smear campaign of that lady instead of just paying few thousand medical bills. I just had this conversation last weekend. The coffee was so hot it melted her labia together. She wasn't driving, they were actually parked when it happened, and McDonald's had been sued before because of people getting hurt by their coffee. I would say way above serving temp, not above boiling, which would be possible but irrelevant for the setting. From what I recall, they were trying to make it so it was serving temp by the time people got to their office. Even after a ton of people had burned themselves, they continued to serve their coffee far hotter than anywhere else. Edited since everyone is focusing on being pedantic instead of the actual context. This one always makes me so angry when people reference it as a frivolous suit. That poor woman went into shock as she suffered third-degree burns over 6% of her body and lesser burns over 16% of her body. She lost 20% of her body weight, bringing her down to 83 pounds while she underwent extensive skin grafting. All she wanted was McDonald's to pay for her medical bills of $20,000 and they refused. The pain she endured was unimaginable. If you've seen the pictures, you know how horrific it was. If you haven't seen them, look them up if you have a strong stomach. She did not walk away with millions as many think. Her initial award was $2.7 million, but the judge reduced it to $640,000, which McDonald's appealed. She eventually settled for an undisclosed amount, which of course, was less than the $640,000. After attorney fees of a third of the award, if she even got $200,000, I'd be surprised. Looking at her burns as she lay in the hospital bed, knowing what she went through, knowing her name was dragged through the mud as a money-grubbing faker, after a long dragged-out legal battle as a frail old woman, no one would look at her and say, yeah, that was worth it. Another important note about this case, is she wasn't the first one to sue over the hot coffee. McDonald had a half-dozen-plus lawsuits over the same thing before. This one ended up being more severe than the other. The combinations of the severity and negligence from McDonald's knowing their coffee was too hot and burning others is what led to the large settlement. The song looked like it was something made for $2,000 by a cut-rate music studio for a peppy Southern California teenager to be posted for free on YouTube. And that's exactly what it was. There was no more reason to take it seriously enough to warrant any negative opinion of Rebecca Black than there would be to get angry over a kid's refrigerator paintings. This was a very sad case. The poor woman was depressed after the way she was treated over this. It's entirely unfair. Sadly, people are often quick to believe things without checking facts first, and it's hard to get them to admit that they were wrong in their judgments. Ignaz Philipp Semmelweis. He was a Hungarian physician and scientist, described as the savior of mothers. He proposed the practice of washing hands with chlorinated lime solutions in 1847 while working in Vienna General Hospital's first obstetrical clinic, where doctors' wards had 3 times the mortality of midwives' wards. Some doctors were offended at the suggestion that they should wash their hands and mocked him for it. In 1865 he allegedly suffered a nervous breakdown and was committed to an asylum by his colleagues. In the asylum he was beaten by the guards. He died 14 days later from a gangrenous wound on his right hand that may have been caused by the beating. His findings earned widespread acceptance only years after his death, when Louis Pasteur confirmed the germ theory. That was a sad case. He couldn't really prove the germs actually existed, but he had statistics to prove that mothers who gave birth with doctor who had washed their hands had a significantly higher chance of surviving, and the doctors were all so arrogant that they never even considered that his conclusion was right, but that maybe he got the details wrong, which he didn't. He got them right, but this would have been a reasonable way to be skeptical of his claims at the time. Apparently it wasn't uncommon for doctors to go straight from something like performing an autopsy to delivering a baby without washing their hands. This is one of the reasons I try to keep some semblance of skepticism about the things we all know to be true even now. I wonder what we believe at this time in history that will be disproved someday, like this, and the earth being flat, etc. I have a feeling there are a few medical and nutritional facts that will be viewed in a similar way someday. All very true. I read a book about him and it sounded like a lot of this had to do with his personality. He was difficult to deal with, even his colleagues who supported and believed his work had a hard time with him. He refused to publish his work for years because he didn't have faith in his writing skills, much to the frustration of those colleagues. When he finally presented his work, he did an incredibly poor job of it that left him open to criticism, which other doctors were happy to do since it supported them not having to wash their hands and also not having to be at fault. That was another part of it. Doctors partially didn't want to accept this because it would mean that they were at fault for the death of hundreds of their patients, a hard pill to swallow. It still would have been an uphill battle for someone with a calmer personality, but he didn't do a lot to get people to understand and accept his research. Well, obviously doctors are gentlemen and gentlemen's hands are always clean. How dare anyone suggest otherwise? That was part of the argument. As if somehow being a wealthy man makes you cleaner. Yep. The doctors and med students were cutting into cadavers then immediately delivering babies without knowing they should wash their hands first. Can you imagine? I believe the data even showed that fatalities were higher on certain days of the week, which had also spread through word of mouth among mothers. Roscoe Fatty Arbuckle. From the Wiki. Roscoe Conkling Fatty Arbuckle, March 24, 1887 to June 29, 1933, was an American silent film actor, comedian, director, and screenwriter. He started at the Selig Polyscope Company and eventually moved to Keystone Studios, where he worked with Mabel Normand and Harold Lloyd as well as with his nephew, Al St. John. He also mentored Charlie Chaplin, Monty Banks, and Bob Hope, and brought vaudeville star Buster Keaton into the movie business. Arbuckle was one of the most popular silent stars of the 1910s and one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, signing a contract in 1920 with Paramount Pictures for $1 million a year, equivalent to $13,527,000 in 2021. Arbuckle was the defendant in 3 widely publicized trials between November 1921 and April 1922 for the rape and manslaughter of actress Virginia Rapp. Rapp had fallen ill at a party hosted by Arbuckle at San Francisco's St. Francis Hotel in September 1921, and died 4 days later. A friend of Rapp accused Arbuckle of raping and accidentally killing her. The first 2 trials resulted in hung juries, but Keaton testified for the defense in the third trial, which acquitted Arbuckle. The third jury took the unusual step of giving Arbuckle a written statement of apology for his treatment by the justice system. Despite Arbuckle's acquittal, the scandal has mostly overshadowed his legacy as a pioneering comedian. At the behest of Adolf Zucker, president of Famous Players Lasky, his films were banned by motion picture industry censor Will H. Hayes after the trial, and he was publicly ostracized. Zucker was faced with the moral outrage of various groups such as the Lord's Day Alliance, the powerful Federation of Women's Clubs and even the Federal Trade Commission to curb what they perceived as Hollywood debauchery run amok and its effect on the morals of the general public. While Arbuckle saw a resurgence in his popularity immediately after his third trial, in which he was acquitted, Zucker decided he had to be sacrificed to keep the movie industry out of the clutches of censors and moralists. Hayes lifted the ban within a year, but Arbuckle only worked sparingly through the 1920s. In their deal, Keaton promised to give him 35% of the Buster Keaton comedy's co-profits. He later worked as a film director under the pseudonym William Goodrich. He was finally able to return to acting, making short 2 reel comedies in 1932-33 for Warner Brothers.